And so it was the skyscraper that allowed cities to grow upward. This meant that a city was no longer bound by its physical size, by just the land on which it was built. This meant now that it really didn't matter how many people were moving into a city. You could keep going through and using the technology to take the existing buildings, you'd have to tear those down and build further up. And this was going to be the pattern from this point on, really. From now forward, you're not going to see a lot of, like one-story buildings or things like that built in the big cities. You're only going to see multi-story buildings going up because land was at such a premium. Now, it wasn't, however, just the skyscrapers. It wasn't just the buildings that led to changes in cities. Okay? We also had the issue of transportation. Now, changes in transportation allowed cities to grow outward. It allowed them to grow laterally. Now, in some cases, you had places like New York, where you had, a limited amount of land, and as a result, up was your only choice. But there are different cities all over the country that had the option of building up, but also to build outward. And they would go through and they would use mass transportation, public transportation, to try and help get the people, the citizens of their city, from where they were living to where the work actually was. 1888, Richmond, Virginia. Richmond is going to become the very first city in America to use electric-powered streetcars. And what you can do, you can kind of think in terms of like the cable cars over in San Francisco. Okay, it's a similar type design. Basically, it's the bus of the day. These would run on electricity. There would be wires run overhead. The particular streetcar would get that energy, or electricity rather, and then it would use it to move people around the city. And what this meant was that by the turn of the century, this starts in 1888, within about 10 or 12 years, there were streetcars all over the place. And this allowed people to live pretty much anywhere within a city. They could live in outlying neighborhoods and use the streetcars to get to stores, offices, factories, anything, downtown. You were no longer limited to having to live close to where you worked. Now, this was quite literally the beginning of the concept of commuting. You can think about the Central Valley. We have a great number of people who commute on a daily basis over to the Bay Area. I know a number of people who will commute from our general area here down to places like Fresno. So you're looking at people who are willing to go sometimes 2 or more hours a day one direction to try and have either a better place to live or because of the job that's available. But the fact that we now are using mass transportation in the cities like this, it meant you could live anywhere in the town. You were no longer bound to one particular area. If you could find a great apartment someplace in the city, you were able to use that and you then take the streetcar to work, for example. This was really the beginning of allowing people more freedom. If you weren't tied to having to live immediately next to where you were working, or at least within very short walking distance, now people could do more things. And you'll see after World War II, for example, we're going to talk about the spread of suburban sprawl, is what they call it. The fact that people were now buying homes in different places and commuting to work. This was the beginning of that. The practical upshot of all this, you didn't have to live close to work anymore. You no longer had to have that place very close by. And many people, they don't want to live immediately next door to work, for example. A lot of people would rather have some kind of distance, and it depends on the individual, between where home is and where work is. That way you have some kind of, real differentiation that you can tell work is work and home is home. But we still are going to run into the problem with transportation of the need for space and the crowding that was going on. Most of us at one point or another have been in traffic, and very few of us like to be in heavy traffic. We've all experienced, I'm sure, at one point or another, the concept of the stop-and-go traffic, that there's quite literally just too many cars at that particular moment in that particular place. Same kind of problem was going on here. Now, the streetcars, yes, you could have them on the ground. But just like with the skyscrapers, there was an alternative. You didn't have to go just at ground level. Now, to avoid overcrowding on the streets, some cities moved their streetcars above street level, elevated trains. Now, you see some of this in New York. You really see it in Chicago. It is the idea that they took the tracks upon which the streetcars would be moving, and then they just built basically bridges underneath them. They raised them up off the ground level, which meant that you still had the streetcars moving people around, but they weren't fighting for the space on the streets themselves. So this helped prevent overcrowding. So you do have some of them up above street level. Those are referred to as Ls, or elevated trains. Other cities moved things underground, subways. Now, New York is the most famous for a subway system, I would argue, in the United States, but really it was Boston that was the first to go underground. So again, all of these different aspects of life all have to do with the large number of people in the various cities and how we're using technology to try and figure out, how do we get around this? How do we fix this problem? Now you have a lot of space for people to live. You have the ability for them to go back and forth to work fairly easily, and you're seeing a lot of benefits coming as a result of this technology. We had all these problems, and we looked at technology to help fix them, and things were at least moving forward. Now, another thing that steel was really good for was that steel bridges now allowed different sections of cities to be joined across rivers. Beforehand, if you were in a city and there was a river there, if you had a bridge, that was great. Oftentimes that might be difficult, and you'd have to use a ferry to get back and forth, and you'd have to pay money for that. And you think about it, if you're in a little boat like that being ferried across a river, you're not going to have a huge number of people able to be in that boat at the same time. Steel bridges meant that you could now cross much larger distances. Those bridges could now carry much more weight, and they could allow for more transportation back and forth. So again, you're seeing a problem that was in different cities, that you might have different sections of the city divided by a river. Take Chicago, for example. It has a river running right through it. And as a result of using steel, again, thank you, Andrew Carnegie, and the Bessemer process, you could now build all these different bridges and link your city together. So you have another issue being solved by technology. Now, I mentioned before that cities were, at the outset, kind of a haphazard design. It was just sort of whatever building went up wherever it happened to be. So sometimes you would have a school, which would be next door to an apartment building, which would be next door to, say a slaughterhouse or something like that, or a garbage dump and things along those lines. Well, we needed to go through and try and organize the cities a little better. Today, if you have a city, there's different zoning laws. You have areas that are just for residential, where people live, and even that will be subdivided between high-density residential and low-density residential, houses versus apartments. You'll have areas that are industrial, areas that are commercial, and things like that. Late 1800s, early 1900s, we're getting into the concept of city planning. And one of the things that the city planners thought were going to make cities more livable was the creation of parks. And again, this is one of those things that we don't think a lot about. We don't put a lot of thought into parks. We have a tendency to go to parks, we enjoy them and things like that. But these were really rather unique at the time. There was a journalist and farmer, one of the names you guys had on your frayer. His name is Frederick Law Olmsted. Now, he was really the leader in the concept of city planning. Okay, or planning for city parks and whatnot. He was a guy who really felt that the city would benefit from having parks. Any city would benefit from having parks. That the people within that city would benefit from having those parks, because you don't want something where it's just brick and steel all the time, that's all you see. A lot of people want some kind of exposure to nature where they can actually see birds and flowers and things along those lines. So Frederick Law Olmsted, is going to really be the leader for planned city parks. Now, it was in 1858, so we're going back. This is pre-Civil War, ladies and gentlemen. 1858, Olmsted and an architect friend of his drew up plans for a park in New York City. That would come to be known as Central Park. And here is a map of the park itself. So you can see it's got lakes there, it's got trails, has a little bit of everything. And you see the grid around it. Those are the city blocks. So Central Park takes up a sizable chunk of property in Manhattan. However, it is used by a great number of people. A lot of people will go through and they will go there for sports. They'll go play baseball or softball or things like that. They'll just go on walking or biking trails. Sometimes they'll go just to, sit and watch the ducks or whatnot, as they go through the lakes. But this was a big change. This was a huge chunk of land was going to be used up. And remember, we've already talked about how valuable land was in New York. So this park is not going to be, just a cheap thing. It's going to end up being worth a lot of money. Now, the finished park, like I said, it included boating, tennis facilities. There is a zoo there, ladies and gentlemen. Bicycle paths, all sorts of things. And it was all set up and placed in a natural setting. This would allow the people of New York, it would allow the folks, the children, all the people who were there, instead of just seeing brick and steel all the time, they had areas of green grass, they had areas where they could go play, they had areas where they could just sit back and sort of enjoy the beauty of something natural. Central Park is still of exceeding importance to the people of New York, and it is still maintained to this day. It still has the same, footprint that you can see here, and the properties around it are quite expensive. One of the areas is called Central Park West. It's the area on the west side of Central Park, and the houses there, the apartments and things like that, are quite pricey, mostly because you've got a view of the park. But we talk about New York, but as I've said before, it wasn't just New York that you're seeing things like this, okay? Now, in Chicago, you got a guy by the name of Daniel Burnham. And what he wanted to do was right along the edge of Lake Michigan, sort of a swampy kind of area, he wanted to go through and change that into a recreational area. Okay, you think about it. Swampland, not very popular. It's not going to be worth a ton of money, but it can be changed and it can be used to make something that would benefit the city of Chicago. So in this case, he's going to make a plan of a variety of different parks, plural. He's going to string them together. There's going to be a series of parks. There's going to be a series of, like sandy beaches and things like that. In Chicago, for example, going to Lake Michigan is essentially like, it's almost like going to the beach here. It is a place where people go to relax. And so if you can have parks and you can have beaches and things like that, you're going to have an area that is going to benefit the people of your city. It's going to benefit the city in general because it's going to help increase property values. It's going to benefit your city because people are in a better mood. It's going to benefit the people because they have some place to go for their recreational purposes. So New York's going to have Central Park. Chicago's going to have Daniel Burnham going through and creating, his series of parks to make Chicago a little bit better. And I've personally been to Chicago. They do have some very lovely spots along Lake Michigan there.